Work his way in, got it on the wing for a shot by Neal. It's blocked high by Rapp and palmed away by Seidenberg. Marchand able to move it back up ice again. Watched by Engelland, picked by Bennett who wiped out. Marchand dropped it back. McQuaid with a shot. He scores!
Disjointed line change, I think, opens up a bunch of Bruin opportunities.
Well, Brad Marchand at the end of a long shift. But here's the eventual goal score. And Pierre's talking about what's going on in this area on the change. And here comes McQuaid. Top shelf. Look how far out Vokoun is. Right.
Welcome, everybody, to the Puck Drops here on another revisiting episode. This is the 2013 Eastern Conference champion Boston Bruins, who had a wonderful year after placing fourth in their conference. This hockey club had, it was composed of a unit that was relatively unchanged in a changing salary cap era of the team 2 seasons ago that had won the Stanley Cup against the Vancouver Canucks. And this was a team made for a championship run. And though they did finish fourth in their conference, second in the division in the Northeast behind 2-seeded Montreal Canadiens by 1 point for the Boston Bruins, they were good enough to play through the playoffs, having home ice at least through one round. And the Boston Bruins had a large roster that was composed, as it was said, mostly of players that were on that championship team. Patrice Bergeron, the alternate captain, who would become an even bigger leader in this playoff year, had played at an extreme level this season as a great centerman for the Boston Bruins. Chris Bourque, one of the few players that was not on that team that won the Stanley Cup 2 seasons prior before. Gregory Campbell was a down-low center. Jordan Caron, Kasparis Dubois, Nathan Horton, the hero of that 2011 year, was in prime form late in the year and into the playoffs for the Boston Bruins. They ended up getting a new face, though, who was in Russia at that time, and taking Jaromir Jagr from the Philadelphia Flyers, and he would become a central piece in the offense of the Boston Bruins. Chris Kelly, a prime force in the last 2 years for the Boston Bruins, was back. David Krejci, huge-time scorer, kicked it up a notch for them. Milan Lucic, similar situation. Lane McDermott for the Boston Bruins. Brad Marchand, who had continued his scoring touch and got even better in the regular season, although a slow start in the playoffs. Danny Paille got even better as a low-tool guy, really showed his scoring touch. Jay Pandolfo, the former Devil winger, came to the Bruins to try to win a championship. Rick Peverley was back. The rookie from 2 years ago that was insane against Tampa in the conference final, Tyler Seguin, was back in what would prove to be his last season as a Boston Bruin. Carl Soderberg, a rookie, and Ryan Spooner, Jamie Tardif, and Sean Thornton was a big defenseman who meant a lot for them in their Cup final run 2 seasons before. Matt Barkowski and Johnny Boychuk, two of the defensemen that were stable, and of course the leader of the entire hockey club in Zdeno Chara, the captain. Andrew Ferentz was back. Young Dougie Hamilton was back. Aaron Johnson. And they brought in a small rookie in Torrey Krug late in the playoffs, who proved to be an absolute horse on defense. Adam McQuaid, who is gelling into a superstar on defense for the Boston Bruins. And Wade Redden and Dennis Seidenberg in his 4th year as a Bruin. On goaltending, there was no Tim Thomas. He was in Dallas. So the main star was finally to see the gem in Tuukka Rask gel to a giant proportion. And if he had any issues, back up Anton Hudobin would be the guy to back him up. And the Bruins had a roster that was just waiting. But as the season was about to start, because of the turmoil of a unbelievable 7-game loss to the Washington Capitals, including being down in the series in Game 6, the Bruins didn't even get to start practice and start their games because of a large lockout, the last lockout in NHL history to this point. They finally got to play in January, and it was a shortened season, but as we said, with the 48 wins, they were able to finish 4th in that regular season. There they would end up playing the 5-seeded team, a team that succeeded expectations for the first time, that was in the playoffs for the first time since 2004, in the Toronto Maple Leafs. And they began a series which started overwhelmingly in Boston's favor, but would turn out to be one of the prime organizational playoff series in NHL history. It started in TD Garden, Game 1, Maple Leafs and Bruins, and the Maple Leafs were starting their young gem in James Reimer in goal, and the Bruins at Tuukka Rask. 1:54 into the first, James Van Riemsdyk's first playoff goal as a Maple Leaf after coming over from the Philadelphia Flyers made it 1-0 Toronto on a power play goal. They had 20 shots on Rask in a losing effort, and Boston had 40 shots, scoring 4 of them on the goaltender Reimer. With 3:40 left in the first period, Wade Redden tied it for the Boston Bruins. With 12 seconds left in the first period, low and under the side, his first goal of the playoffs on a power play, Nathan Horton made it 2-1 Bruins. 10:25 into the second, Krejci extended the lead to 3, and a ripper from the point by Johnny Boychuk. 15:44 into the second period made it 4-1, and that would be all for the Boston Bruins, taking a 1-0 lead in this best of 7. Game 2 in TD Garden was paramount for a young Toronto Maple Leaf team needing to win on the road, and they would get the momentum that was needed in that game number 2. Toronto had 32 shots on Tuukka Rask, scoring 4 goals, and the Boston Bruins had a whopping 41 shots on Reimer, but he was excellent, scoring only 2 goals to the Boston Bruins. There were no goals in the first period for the first time. At a minute 56 in, Nathan Horton got his second goal of the playoffs, making it 1-0 Boston Bruins. Then 5:18 into the second, Jeffrey Lupul made a great move to tie the game on a power play. 11:56 in, Jeffrey Lupul made it 2-1 Maple Leafs heading into the third, and there the Maple Leafs would dominate. With his first playoff goal as a Toronto Maple Leaf and first playoff goal since 2009, Phil Kessel, 53 seconds in, would make it 3-1 Toronto. 10:35 into the third, Johnny Boychuk would cut the lead in half, but Kessel's goal ended up being the game winner. As 16:53 into the third, Toronto would make it 4-2 on a wonderful goal by James Van Riemsdyk, and they would tie the series going to the Air Canada Centre. There, Boston would reign supreme in Eastern Canada. In a regulation game, Toronto had a whopping 47 shots on Tuukka Rask, but only scoring twice, where the Bruins had 38 shots on Reimer, getting 5 pucks past the Great Leaf goaltender. And for the second straight game, the Bruins struck first, 13:42, and it was Adam McQuaid's first goal of the playoffs to make it 1-0 Bruins. The first Bruin playoff point by Jaromir Jagr was a pass to Rick Peverley, 5:57 into the second to make it 2-0 Bruins. The first playoff goal in his career for the Toronto Maple Leafs, Jake Gardiner, 13:45 in, cut the lead in half on a power play for the Maple Leafs. But 14:35 into the second, 50 seconds later, Nathan Horton would make it 3-1 Boston Bruins with his third goal in as many games. Danny Paille, 16:37 into the second on a shorthanded goal, would make it 4-1 heading into the third. There, Phil Kessel would gather his second goal of the playoffs with passes from Van Riemsdyk and Franzen on a power play, 47 seconds in. But then, with an empty netter, 117 in remaining in the game, David Krejci would make it 5-2, and the Bruins would head to game number 4, up 2-1 in Toronto. And there the Maple Leafs would fight for an overtime game, which would happen the first overtime game of the series, and the shots showed. Toronto had 48 shots in a losing effort on Tuukka Rask, the absolute stellarness of the Bruins goaltender, and Boston had 45 shots on James Reimer. In the first period, though, it was Toronto who struck first, 2:35, and Jeffrey Lupul made it 1-0 Maple Leafs. With 1:28 left in the first period, Cody Franzen made it 2-0 Toronto. That it stayed until 32 seconds right into the second frame, where Bergeron scored his first goal of the playoffs, cutting the lead in half. 12:59 into the second, Krejci tied the game for the Boston Bruins. 16:39 into the second period, Krejci gave the Bruins a 3-2 lead on a power play. And then 17:23 into the second, Clark MacArthur by passes by Frotten and Jake Gardiner tied the game. And then it would go to overtime, where Nathan Horton would play the puck and get absolutely rammed by Franzen. And as he played the puck around the boards, David Krejci was able to skate with it, and seeing no opposition on his stick side as the Maple Leafs were completely committed to a pass, Krejci ripped one top shelf under the bar on the goaltender Reimer to give the Bruins a 3-1 series lead, heading to Boston with a chance to go to the second round. And the Bruins would have a close one-goal game for the second straight game in Boston, but they would not be able to win, as Toronto would find the spark that they got in Game 2 in that building. The Bruins had 44 shots in a regulation loss on Reimer, and he was insane. He stopped every single one but one. Toronto had 33 shots on Rask. Rask was amazing as well, but he let up 2 goals. In the first, there was no score. 11:27 into the second, Tyler Bozak on a shorthanded goal made it 1-0 Maple Leafs. 1:58 into the third, Clark MacArthur got it to 2-0 Toronto lead, and the only goal, 11:12 into the third, scored by Zdeno Chara, his first of the playoffs, to cut the lead in half. So now the lead was 3-2 in the series, and they would go back to the Air Canada Centre, the Bruins looking to take down the Maple Leafs and go to the second round. There, Boston would have 30 shots on Reimer, but again, only able to solve him once. Toronto had 26 shots on Rask, but they solved him twice. No goals in the first or second, but it started with the captain, Dion Phaneuf's first goal of the playoffs, a minute 48 in, to make it 1-0 Maple Leafs. 8:59 into the third, the former Bruin Phil Kessel would score the game-winning goal to make it 2-0, because in the third period, with 26 seconds left, Milan Lucic would cut the lead in half in Toronto, but it would be enough to send the game back, in the series back to Boston for a 7th game, and this would be one of the more legendary games in both franchises' Original Six history. Boston, in an overtime game, would gather 35 shots in a victorious effort on James Reimer, and Toronto would gather 28 shots on goal on the goaltender Tuukka Rask. Matt Barkowski, 5:39 in, sent the home fans into a frenzy and an unassisted goal to make it 1-0 Bruins. But then Boston fell apart. 9:35 into the first, Cody Franzen, by passes from Van Riemsdyk and Dion Phaneuf, tied the hockey game on a power play. 5:48 into the second, Franzen got his second of the game, making it 2-1. The former Bruins sniped his former team in the third period. It was Phil Kessel's 4th goal of the series and 4th goal of the playoff year, 2:09 in, to make it 3-1 in favor of the Maple Leafs. 5:29 into the third, Nazem Kadri made it 4-1, and with 10:30 left in the third period, it was 4-1 Maple Leafs. Maple Leaf Square was going crazy, and it looked like the Maple Leafs would find a way. But as the Bruins had been doing for the last 3 years, whenever there was adversity, Nathan Horton would come up and play big. And he did. 9:18 in, his 4th goal of the playoffs, cut the lead in 4-2. Then, with a minute and 22 left, Milan Lucic cut the lead in half as the Bruins had already emptied their net with the first attacker. And then with 51 seconds remaining, the puck was cleared along by Jaromir Jagr on the Krejci and onto the middle of the center. And Krejci gave it to Bergeron, and Bergeron blasted a shot top shelf over Reimer to tie the hockey game. And just as the Bruins had done in early January against the New York Rangers, which was critical points, they had come back down with the goalie pulled twice to tie the hockey game. And it would go to overtime, and the Bruins had all of the momentum after being down 4-1, and in one of the most insane goals and moments ever, Marchand had a shot that went off the stick of the goaltender Reimer. Then it went to Tyler Seguin off the pad, and Patrice Bergeron ended the Leafs season, pointing the dagger into the hearts of all Toronto fans, ending it and winning it in one of the most memorable goals in playoff history, and ending a wonderful series for the Boston Bruins. There, they would go to the second round after a 7-game series and take on the New York Rangers, who had just upset in 7 games the Washington Capitals. And then in game number 1, this would be another hockey game that would go past the 3 normal periods. Boston in an overtime game would get 48 shots on the goaltender Henrik Lundqvist, and New York would have 35 shots on Tuukka Rask. Nothing in the first period, but 12:23 into the second, a blasting shot by Zdeno Chara, his second goal of the playoffs, made it 1-0 Bruins. With only 2 seconds left in the second period, Ryan McDonough would tie it for the New York Rangers. And 14 seconds into the third period, Derek Stepan would make it 2-1 Rangers, his third goal of the playoffs. And the rookie Torrey Krug would tie the game on a power play, 2:55 in, 2-2 for the Boston Bruins. Then 15:40 into the overtime, about 5 minutes left, Brad Marchand from a key pass right under the wheelhouse by Patrice Bergeron would make it 3-2, his first goal of the playoffs for Marchand, and an overtime winner for the Boston Bruins and a 1-0 series lead. Game number 2 would come, and in TD Garden, the Boston Bruins would hold an absolute smacking of the New York Rangers, 5-2. They got 32 shots on Henrik Lundqvist, and the New York Rangers had 37 shots on Tuukka Rask. But Tuukka Rask was on a whole nother level. 5:20 into the first, Krug got his second goal of playoffs, 5:28 in. Then 8:01 into the first, Ryan Callahan's second goal, the Ranger captain, would tie it at 1. Gregory Campbell, 2:24 into the second, would make it 2-1 Bruins, and the first Ranger playoff goal by Rick Nash, 3:20 in, would tie the hockey game at 2. But then it would all be Bruins. 12:08 into the second, Johnny Boychuk gave Boston their first lead. 26 seconds into the third period, Brad Marchand would make it 4-2, his second goal of the playoffs. And 12:39 into the third, Milan Lucic would end the party 5-2 for the Boston Bruins, going to Madison Square Garden up 2-0. There for the third one-goal game and the second one-goal game in 3 games, Boston would heave 34 shots on Henrik Lundqvist, and Lundqvist was amazing, but they would end up winning the hockey game. New York had only 24 shots on Tuukka Rask, scoring once. And the Rangers would strike first again, 3:53 in. The second period, Taylor Pyatt from Ryan McDonough to make it 1-0 Rangers. And 3:10 into the third, Johnny Boychuk would tie the game, his fourth goal of the playoffs, at 1. Danny Pyatt, 6:29 into the third, ended up getting the game-winning goal under 4 to go to make it 2-1 and gave the Bruins a 3-0 commanding series lead. and a 3-0 series lead for the Boston Bruins in a playoff series for the first time since the second round against the Philadelphia Flyers in 2011. That series they would sweep, but this series they would not. A game that would go to overtime in Madison Square Garden, the second overtime contest of the series, and the Bruins would have 40 shots on goal, on Henrik Lundqvist scoring 3 of them. The Rangers would have 32 in a victorious effort, including the game-winning goal. 4:39 into the second, it was Horton to score the first goal of the hockey game, his 5th goal of the playoffs on a power play for the Boston Bruins. Torrey Krug, 7:41 into the second, would make it 2-0 Bruins. Carl Hagelin's 3rd of the playoffs, 8:39 in, would make it cut the lead in half for the Rangers. Derek Stepan, 1:15 in, would tie the game for the New York Rangers. Then 8:06 into the third, Sagan's first goal of the playoffs made it 3-2 Bruins. And then 10 minutes into the third period, Brian Boyle would tie the game on a power play for the New York Rangers. Then it would go to overtime where McDonough would race behind the net, giving on for Nash, who made a Bruin crew sit down and fake, and Chris Kreider was able to poke it right past the stick side of Tuukka Rask and win the game in overtime, keeping the Rangers alive in the series. There they would go to TD Garden, and there would be no one-goal game. It would be a 2-goal game and a winning game for the Boston Bruins. And the Bruins had 32 shots on Henrik Lundqvist in a victorious effort. The Rangers had 29 shots on Tuukka Rask. And again, the Rangers scored first, however. 10:39 in, Dan Girardi made it 1-0 New York. Torrey Krug scored his 4th goal of the playoffs, 4th goal series, 3:48 in, tying the game on a power play. 13:41 in, Gregory Campbell would score the game-winning goal. And an empty net goal with 51 seconds left by Campbell's second to make it 3-1 Bruins and send Boston to a conference final for the second time in 3 seasons. There they would play the number 1 seed and second overall record in the National Hockey League, the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, the Pittsburgh Penguins. And for the first time in the playoffs since they were in the Stanley Cup final against the Vancouver Canucks 2 seasons before, the Bruins would start on the road. And there they would go into Consol Energy Center in Pittsburgh. And for the first time all playoff long, Tuukka Rask would end up being rewarded with his hard work and gathering a shutout. Pittsburgh had 29 shots on Tuukka Rask. He stopped them all. The Boston Bruins had 30 shots on the goaltender Tomas Vokoun, and they scored 3 times. 8:23 into the first, Krejci from Nathan Horton and Andrew Ference made it 1-0 Boston. David Krejci, 4:04 into the third, made it 2-0 Bruins on his second goal of the game. And with his 6th goal of the playoffs, Nathan Horton continued his hot streak, 7:51 in, to make it 3-0 Bruins and close out game number 1 for the Boston Bruins. Game number 2 would ensue in Consol Energy Center against the Pittsburgh Penguins. And Boston would have 29 shots on goal on the goaltender Vokoun. Pittsburgh would have 27 shots on Tuukka Rask. And it would not be enough for the Pittsburgh Penguins as they were absolutely throttled 6-1 at home. 28 seconds into the first period, Brad Marchand scored his 3rd goal unassisted. Nathan Horton, his 7th goal of the playoffs, 14:37 in, made it 2-0 Boston. David Krejci, 16:31 into the first, made it 3-0 Bruins. Brandon Sutter, with 24 seconds left in the first period, made it 34 seconds left in the first period, cut the lead in half, got the first and only goal for the Pittsburgh Penguins, his 2nd goal of the playoffs, first since the New York Islanders series in the first round. And with 9 seconds left in the first period, Marchand got his 4th goal of the playoffs, 2nd of the hockey game. There would be nothing in the second period, and then Patrice Bergeron, 27 seconds in, would make it 5-1 Bruins. and Johnny Boychuk would rip a shot to make it 6-1 Boston and head to TD Garden up 2-0. The storyline of this series, of course, being the sudden movement in the regular season at the trade deadline of ex-Flame Jerome McGinley, who was given a player's choice by the Calgary organization to either go to the Boston Bruins or the Pittsburgh Penguins. And he felt Pittsburgh, with the excellent season that Crosby was having, would give him a much better chance to win. And the Boston Bruins felt that they were snubbed and thought that this was a case of motivation to show that they were better. Game number 3, one of the longer games the Bruins have played all series and season long, a double overtime contest that the Penguins played the best in out of all 4 games in a series. They had 54 shots on Tuukka Rask, and Boston had 40 shots on Tomas Vokoun. But 1:42 into the first period, it again was kickstarted by the Bruins, and again by David Krejci, his 9th goal, 4th all playoff series. Chris Kunitz, 8:51 into the second, would tie the game at 1, and it would go to double overtime, where Yevgeny Malkin would try to pin the puck and give it to Pittsburgh players looking for Sutter off a Penguin line change, but battling with Malkin was Jaromir Jagr for the Boston Bruins, and he was able to pin the puck, wait, stick his body out to conceal, and give it to Brad Marchand, who raced off the wall and did a perfect pass, almost like the goal that was scored against the Rangers in Game 1 of the second round, to the stick of Patrice Bergeron, who had ended the game. And 15:09 into this double overtime, 15:19 into the double overtime, which gave the Bruins a 3-0 series lead over the Penguins. With that, they would end up getting ready for Game 4 with a chance to sweep, and for the second time in 3 years going to the Stanley Cup Final. Pittsburgh overwhelmed on the shots again with 26 shots on Tuukka Rask, but Rask stood tall and got a shutout. An absolutely amazing performance by him, especially at the end conclusion of the game with about 12 straight block shots for the Boston Bruins. The Bruins had 24 shots on Pittsburgh and on Vokoun, scoring one of them, 5-1 in to the third. Adam McQuaid's top shelf under the post ripper, which made it 1-0, and it was the only game-winning goal and the only goal of the hockey game. That ended up being absolutely paramount, and the Bruins would win the Eastern Conference. There they would go to the Stanley Cup Final to play another prime Original Six franchise in the Chicago Blackhawks. And this would be an even longer game that they would play after already playing Game 3 in double overtime. Game number 1 in the Stanley Cup Final, United Center went to triple overtime, with the Blackhawks getting 63 shots in a victorious effort, scoring 4 of them on Tuukka Rask. The Bruins had 54 shots in a losing effort, scoring 3 goals from Corey Crawford. 13-11 into the first period, Lucic made it 1-0 Bruins. His 4th goal of the playoffs. 51 seconds into the second period, Milan Lucic made it 2-0 Bruins. Brandon Saad, his first goal of the playoffs in his career, 3:08 into the second, cut the lead in half for the Chicago Blackhawks. 6:09 into the third, Bergeron's 6th goal on a power play made it 3-1 Boston. 8 minutes into the third, Dave Bolland's first goal of the playoffs wouldn't be his last, cut the lead in half, 3-2. And then Johnny Oduya, 12:14 into the third, tied the game with passes by Kruger and Michael Frolik for the Chicago Blackhawks. Eventually, on a triple overtime play, off a deflection on a shot by Dave Bolland and a great pass by Michael Rosefall, 12:08 into the triple overtime, Andrew Shaw's 5th goal, the young player would score in the playoffs, would end game number 1 and give a 1-0 series lead to the President's Trophy champs, Chicago Blackhawks. The next game would also go to overtime, but this would not favor the Blackhawks. They would have 34 shots again on Tuukka Rask, but he only let 1 in a victorious effort, and Boston would have 28 shots on Corey Crawford, scoring 2, including the game winner. 11:22 in the first. This time the Blackhawks scored first. It was Patrick Sharp by passes from Michael Handzus and Patrick Kane. Chris Kelly, 14:58 into the second, tied the game by a great pass by Danny Paille. His first goal, Chris Kelly's, of the playoffs, and his first goal in the playoffs since the overtime winner in Game 1 of the previous year against the Washington Capitals. In overtime, Danny Paille, 13:48 in, would get the game winner to tie the series, going back to Boston with passes from Tyler Seguin and Adam McQuaid. Then the series would go to TD Garden, and the Bruins would reign supreme. For the third time all playoffs, Tuukka Rask would get a shutout, and this would be in the Stanley Cup Final. 28 shots for the Chicago Blackhawks on Rask. He stopped them all. Boston got 35 shots on the goaltender, Corey Crawford, and 2 of them went in. In the first period, no goals, but the supreme play of Danny Paille in the Stanley Cup Final, his third goal in the Stanley Cup Final, fourth all playoff, 2:13 into the second, made it 1-0 Boston Bruins. 14:05 into the second with passes from Chara and Yager. Patrice Bergeron on a power play made it 2-0 Bruins, and they would take a 2-1 series lead heading into Game 4, trying to get up to 3-1, and what a game this was. It would be a game that the Bruins would not win, but another game that went to overtime, the third overtime game of the playoffs, and of the Stanley Cup Final. Chicago would have 47 shots on Tuukka Rask, scoring 6 of them, including the overtime winner. The Boston Bruins would have 33 shots, scoring 5 of them on Corey Crawford. And Handzus scored first again for the Blackhawks, the second time in 4 games, on a shorthanded goal, making it 1-0 Chicago. 14:43 in the first, Peverley tied the game for the Bruins. Second goal all playoffs. First, and it was his first Stanley Cup Final goal since game number 4 2 years prior against the Canucks. 6:33 into the second, Taves from Roosevelt would make it 2-1 Blackhawks. Kane from Bickle and Roosevelt, 8:41 into the second, would make it 3-1 Chicago. Lucic from Chara, 14:43 into the second, would make it 3-2 Bruins. Kruger, 15:32 into the second, would make it 4-2 Blackhawks. 17:22 into the second, Bergeron would cut the lead in half on a power play. And for Bergeron would later, 2:05 into the third, tie the game at 4, his 9th goal of the playoffs. Sharp, 11:19 into the third, get a power play goal to make it 5-4, passes from Marian Hossa and Duncan Keith. Nathan Horton-Krejci would assist Johnny Boychuk's 6th goal of the year, 12:14 in to tie the hockey game, but it would go to overtime, 9:51 in from a sideboard pass by Brian Bickle. Brent Seabrook would wait and blast the puck to beat Tuukka Rask and give the Chicago Blackhawks overtime magic and tie the series at 2. There it would go to Chicago, where the Blackhawks would have the absolute prime chance to take a series lead, and they would. With 32 shots on Rask, they would get the game 1 and a 3-2 series lead. Boston would have 25 shots on Crawford, but Crawford had his best game all series, possibly best game all playoff. 17:27 to the first, Patrick Kane scores 8th goal of the playoffs, 2nd of the Stanley Cup Final to make it 1-0 Blackhawks. Kane's 2nd goal of the game, 5:13 to the second, made it 2-0 Chicago. 3:40 into the third, Zdeno Chara cut the lead in half, his 3rd goal of the playoffs, 12th point to make it 2-1, still in favor of the Blackhawks. And then with 14 seconds left in the third period, Davey Bolland's 2nd goal of the playoffs, 2nd goal of the Stanley Cup Final, an empty netter made it 3-1 Chicago, and Chicago went to TD Garden. Now, this game, most expected for the Boston Bruins to win, and for most of it looked like they would, but a late, unfortunate turn of events would undo their championship hopes. With 25 shots by the Boston Bruins on Corey Crawford, scoring 2 of them, and the Chicago Blackhawks ended up winning in a regulation game with 31 shots on the goaltender Tuukka Rask for the second time in 4 years winning the Stanley Cup in a Game 6. 7:19 into the first, Chris Kelly's 2nd goal by Seguin and Paille made it 1-0 Bruins. An unassisted goal by the captain Taves for the Blackhawks, 4:24 and tied the game. Milan Lucic 12-11 in, made it 2-1 Bruins, and then with the goaltender pulled, the Blackhawks were immediately able to swarm Tuukka Rask, and with a minute and 16 left, Brian Bickle would tie the game by a great pass from Jonathan Taves off the skate side, and then tied. The Blackhawks would immediately move to come across and go at the same speed off of a delayed play on defense as Johnny Oduya would skate along the side. Frolik would roll it off the pad of Rask, who couldn't cover, and Dave Ballin found an open spot for his third goal of the playoffs, third goal of the Stanley Cup final, to make it 3-2 Blackhawks. 2 goals in the span of 25 seconds, and it would be the game-winning goal, and absolute joy would turn to absolute despair for the Boston Bruins. They were not able to get the tying goal in the rest of the 59 seconds, and the Chicago Blackhawks would end up winning the Stanley Cup. But this was a memorable Boston Bruins team I remember very well. You cannot dispute the greatness and the heart that this team had. I hope you guys will enjoy this. The next one, people in my area I know will really like. We're going to be revisiting the 2014 Eastern Conference champion New York Rangers. So if you enjoyed this, have a good day. Happy hockey.